How important is accessing public land to you? It's important to me because I've been chasing critters on public land for most of my life. In this episode of Fin and Fire with Jeff Mishler, I sit down with Tawney, CEO and president of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. And it's really a great conversation because Land and I discover we have so much common ground. It's hard to explain to someone what's so great about the outdoors. But the fact is, public land is your land, and that's why Land and his organization work so hard to make sure that you have the opportunity to find out for yourself. Finandfire.com is your go-to source for the best hunting and fishing equipment. At finandfire.com, you're going to find Sitka apparel, Mystery Ranch packs, and crispy boots. Finandfire.com is the West's leading retailer of quality products for the everyday hunter and angler. Tawney, thank you for joining us. I'm excited for this podcast because you're the first guest. This is episode number 1, and the reason I chose you as a guest is because you represent something that's so important to so many people who are have spent a lifetime, in the outdoors, either pursuing critters or just experiencing wildlife and nature. And I'd like you to tell me a little bit about what your role is at Backcountry Hunters and Anglers.
Well, first, I'm just an honor to be number 1. I guess no pressure, right?
None.
My job over here at Backcountry Hunters and Anglers is president and CEO. When I first started, I did everything, and now we have quite a robust staff. So I am the CEO and president. Probably big picture. That's
excellent. How big is the organization? I know it started out as a fairly small organization, and actually the idea kind of coalesced around a campfire in Oregon somewhere. So, what's the story there? How did the organization start, and what has it grown to?
Sure. So, all good things happen late night around a campfire, and I'm sure that you understand that. And fire is a part of the name of your podcast, and I think fire is just such an essential piece. I think not only to keep us warm and help us cook, but also I think it's the fuel that is there to have conversations. And that's exactly what was happening that night around the campfires, that people were looking at, the array of groups that are out there. So the Ducks Unlimiteds, the Elk Foundations, the Mule Deer Foundations, all doing amazing work, but very species specific. And then nobody was focused on public lands and public waters. And so organization was formed to make sure you have access to those public lands and waters. And then the fish and wildlife habitat when you get there, if we have access to this parking lot that's outside my office right now, that's not a good place to hunt and fish. Like, we need the quality hunting and fishing when we get there, the quality habitat. So that's why we were started, and I think that was started in 2004. And then I took over in 2013. I was the first full-time staff. At that point, we had 1,000 members, and I will say 1,000 rock star members. These are volunteers that were passionate, knew their place, and could articulate that to elected officials as well as administrative officials. So we had 1,000 people. And today, we're pushing 35,000 members. We've got chapters now in every single state besides Delaware and Hawaii. And then as far as staff goes, we're pushing 40 staff now. So what started really with 1 full-time staff when I started, now we're up to 40. So we've grown exponentially. And it's all because I think the universal idea that every single person has the opportunity to access our public lands and waters, and they get to choose how they want to participate when they get there. So, whether that is as a hunter or an angler, which we kind of look at first, or if that's a hiker or a paddler or a gatherer or a forager, or, just somebody that likes clean air and clean water. Our organization is really, the work that we do, I think, benefits every single American when it comes to our public lands and our public waters and our public wildlife.
Well, that just made me think of, half a dozen questions that I want to ask you. Because the access to public land appeals to so many people, I would also think that the people that this appeals to as an employment opportunity to be employed by this organization is really broad. I mean, it's not like, you're just an office full of specialists. It takes an army of people who have so many different interests and so many different skills. And so that really helps you be effective at that growth, but also I would imagine at being effective at policy.
Absolutely. I think what everybody here at BHA, as far as that works here, and then I would say that also with with our volunteers, leaders all across the country, is they all share a passion for the outdoors, and that exudes out of their body. And I would say in particular for our volunteers who give us a ton of their time and a ton of their talent. At a work level, I think they get paid to do this, but their
Right.
passion is definitely there, which they bring to work every single day. And then their talents, there's no one size fits all here at BHA. Everybody's kind of bringing their own set of expertise to the organization. And it's my job to try to figure out, as that coach, how do we utilize those expertise to get the job done? And I feel like, I'd put our staff up against any other staff out there in the country as far as the dedication to the resource and the dedication to getting the job done.
So a job like this, I mean, it may have just fallen out of the sky for you, or may have been something that just was natural. But, each one of us, I keep kind of harping on this with everyone that I interview, is that, when we're 12, 13, 14 years old, we kind of get an idea what we're going to be when we grow up, or at least we have an idea what we want to be. And what's interesting is to talk to people about, who they are now and how that compares to what those dreams were. And when you were 12 or 13 or 14, did you have a clue that this is what you'd be doing?
I don't think so. I think that, I was playing sports. I was just starting to chase girls around, and, my parents were both heavily involved in conservation. And so, I think that there was probably, if you would have asked me that question at that time, I might have said, something like, oh, I might do something like my parents are doing right now. But I will tell you that the work that they were doing, I wasn't interested like my daughter is, who just turned 14. Like, my daughter knows everything that I do. I wasn't that interested. And I think it was more like osmosis, really, just being around them and being surrounded by, my godfather, that was Jim Posowitz, who, and so I just around these amazing people. But until, my father passed away when I was 19 years old, I don't think that I had an inkling in me this is exactly what I wanted to do. But when he passed away, I think it kind of brought things to clarity to me that I wanted to be a part of something that, that is very unique in the world, and that, I had the upbringing to help me have an understanding of what role I could actually play.
It's interesting that, the passing of a parent or a grandparent has a lot to do with like influence. And my grandfather, he passed when I was 10, and he was a big time duck hunter. And I just remember being immersed with those stories that my grandmother would tell me about my grandfather. He'd go to the Oregon coast and catch sea run cutthroats by just dapping dry flies on the surface. And he was, an amazing duck hunter. I still have one of his early Olt, that Bakelite, Olt duck call, and I still blow it for ducks. I mean, it's just one of those things that I was connected to from an early age. And both my parents worked in the school district. My dad was a teacher, and when I went to college, I had no interest in being a school teacher. I just wanted to hunt and fish. And I don't know if it was, the influence of my grandfather or my grandmother. I really don't know, but there's something in me that just drives me to do that. And then, obviously trying to find a way to make a living around those things is the challenge, just because, it's hunting and fishing after all. So you're trying to make a living. Yeah.
You bring up duck hunting, I think that's something we share. It's that my father was, I wouldn't say an accomplished duck hunter, but he definitely liked to get out there and get after it. And like some of my earliest memories were in the duck blind with him, before I could actually pull the trigger on a gun, but being in the duck blind and, walking to the slough in the morning and hearing the thunderous, chorus of birds as they take off. And then, putting out the decoys in the dark, and then sitting there in anticipation as, the kind of the marsh wakes up, and then watching the dog work, watching those birds that were tricked, I could watch still to this day, in the spring in particular, when I can't hunt and these birds are in, full plumage, they're in their breeding plumage. I can sit on a pothole all day and watch them cupped wings getting into that thing. It's just, I think that happened from a young age. And I thank my father and my mother, for getting me out early.
I don't know what that is, but when they cup, because I mean, for me, it's all about calling. The reason I duck hunt is to call. I don't care if I do like to shoot the mallards because I love to eat the mallards, but I really like to see my buddies shoot the mallards because that means I get to call the mallards. And there's something about when they, when you hit them on that corner and then they turn and cup, and that hen locks up, and then there's a couple more, they're like, oh, I hope she knows what she's talking about. And then they all kind of commit, and then you finally get them to, man, you get them to put their feet down, and it's just like, wow, that was, I don't know. Like you said, I could sit and replay those dreams like all day long and not get anything done. It's in there. It's just a moving picture.
I think it's that active participant, right?
Yeah.
I think we're a part of something, and how lucky are we that we have even the opportunity to do that, and then having the opportunity when it actually all works out. Like you just described how when it works perfect, like how many times does it not work like that, right? And so, it's duck hunting. I will tell you that's one of my favorite things to do. So we share that in particular.
What's interesting about almost everything that I like to do, and duck hunting's one of them, is that if it worked out every single time, I'd be bored with it, right? It's like casting a fly for steelhead. If one ate it on every swing, I'd be like, no more. But there's something about that old rat mentality where if I push the bar 1,000 times and I get one little kibble that falls out of the hopper, I'm going to push it another 1,000 times, maybe another 500 times. It's just, I'm so trained to keep pushing that stupid bar and wait for that stupid little kibble to fall down so I can eat it. Oh, yeah, I don't know. I'm a trained rat. That's basically all it is. So back to those earliest memories.
Yeah.
What's the earliest outdoor memory that sticks with you? I mean, I have a few that aren't really distinct, but what's one of your earliest?
I think, I talked about the duck hunting piece. I'd give you maybe two more. I think that my dad used to hunt elk outside of Yellowstone Park on the very edge. And I remember as a kid distinctly a couple times when, it would just dump. And so there'd be 3 feet of snow. And I'm this, again, my dad was taking me out before I could pull the trigger. And so I was probably 8 years old. And I remember walking up this steep hill. And if I did not literally step in his exact footsteps, I would have not made it up that mountain. I would not have made it up that mountain because it was so deep outside of his footsteps. And as a little 8-year-old, I'm barely able to keep up, as it is. So I think that day, and then that day he ended up shooting a bull elk, snowed even more after he shot the bull elk, and we quartered it up. And I remember riding the quarters down this steep mountain that was covered in snow. And I mean, it was literally, I will never forget that. And so I was about 8 years old. So not my earliest memory, but that one, it sticks out in my brain. The other one I would say is that my dad would take us down to the Big Hole River every year during the salmon fly hatch. So, late May, early part of June, these big bugs that are as big as your pinky, brown trout in particular, are voracious. And it would be the special time. And I didn't realize until later, my dad would always go out early in the morning. And I always thought that was weird. And it just sticks out in my mind that, man, there was this family time. Like, why is he going out early in the morning? And now as a father that has 2 kids, and how crazy it is when you get everybody on the boat and you're untangling line or you're tying new flies on. That morning was with him and his best friend. They were doing that in the morning so they could have their time,
Right.
He's not around for me to, talk to him about that now. But as a father, I think I've come to that realization. So, but that, those 3 things, the eruption of those ducks, I'll never forget, the walking in my dad's footsteps. And then I would say, the salmon fly hatch, just in particular, seeing those big bugs on the water and what the fish do when they see them. I mean, it's just a special thing. And I think that time of year is something I covet every year and I can't miss. It's one of those must do's, I would say, is that late May and early June.
A good friend of mine that I hunt deer with, in fact, I don't know if you can see, nobody can see it, but there's a buck on the wall, but it's funny. It's actually a reflection of a buck in a mirror. And I didn't notice that until just now. That I
thought it was perfect placement, by the way.
It's like, that's kind of weird. I don't know what that is, but it's a round mirror that's on the wall because obviously the listeners can't see it. And however I placed my laptop, there's a big blacktail buck that's been European mounted right in the middle of this mirror. But anyways, so the guy that I hunt with when I shot that deer, a really good friend of mine, and we hunt blacktails every year out near his property, and he tells the exact same story. It's like, I wanted to be my dad. I put my foot in his footprints to tell myself that I was big enough to go on the hunt or big enough to go, on that fishing trip. If I could step in his footsteps, then I knew I was big enough to go along, and it gave him strength and it gave him confidence to do that. And, my dad was really effective at keeping me interested by just saying, well, when you're old enough, you can go. And I'm like, well, how old do I have to be to go? It's like, isn't 6 enough? Is it 6? So, I have those distinct memories. One of my early ones in that time frame, around 8 or 9 years old, was the first winter steelhead that I caught with my dad. I think I told the story or even written about it, and maybe in BHA, I can't remember it. But my grandfather on my dad's side was never much of an angler. And my dad, I probably pestered him more than, I should have to go fishing. And so one day we went fishing and I actually hooked and caught this 8-pound winter steelhead, and it was my first one. I couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. And so as I'm bringing it in, I get it close, and the leader breaks. And what was amazing to me is that even though my grandfather was not a fisher person, he didn't fish for steelhead. When that leader broke, he can't swim, and he just jumped into the swollen river. I mean, it was all muddy to grab that fish. And I remember my grandfather, he cradled this fish in his arms and hooked it up on the bank. He didn't even think about not being able to swim. I mean, probably a week later, he almost drowned on that exact same spot because he saw me catch one, and he took a little boat out there that flipped on him, and he had to go back to, I don't know. It was just like, I can't believe that those opportunities were presented to me. And I think it's just because I wanted to be big and old before I was, and I kept pestering my dad to take me. So our parents have a lot to do with those early experiences, I know.
Well, just like you said, like, these, maybe we do things like 1,000 times and only get one time it works out. Yeah. Like that one time sticks with us, and we're always chasing that. And I think, I will say, and this is a little, I don't know, this is a little woo woo, but like, when my father passed away, the only time that I feel close to him, like really close to him, is now when I'm out in the woods or on the water,
Yeah.
He's, right over the ridge when I'm hunting big game. He's around the corner when I'm fishing, and, when I'm duck hunting, I swear to God, I look over, I feel like he's in the blind with me sometimes. And
he probably
it's not
is
the case. Well, in some way he may be, and I just, but it's all hearkening back to these times that we spent together, that are just so ingrained in me. And no matter what happens in my life, there's no way you can ever take that away from me. And I think that, I'm trying to create the same experiences for my kids now. So that no matter what happens in their life, they always have something to look back at.
Yeah. My dad's still with us. He's like 80 some years old now. And it gets harder and harder for him to do things. And so it's, that's the sadness that I'm experiencing, is that he just can't get out and do the things that we used to do. We used to, hike all over the Coast Range here and kill elk. In November, I counted on it every year with a rifle. It was my favorite time of the year to be out in the woods, but I started doing that before I could legally elk hunt in Oregon, because I was blacktail deer hunting with him at an early age. And all of those experiences have just built into this collage of a life, right? But he's still here. And so the sadness that I feel that he's not able to actually get out and enjoy it as much as he used to, because he's just not physically able to. So having a parent pass, there's something really finite. Obviously, it's final. And then you have these memories that are cataloged. And, with my dad, those memories are stretched out over time, and because there are fewer and fewer experiences being put into that catalog, it's not as clear, right? So the more experiences and memories you have, the less profound those really profound ones are, because they're kind of in this larger collage of life experiences. So totally. I imagine that, having a parent pass at a fairly young age just makes everything so much more profound.
Yeah, I would, and and maybe more grandiose than they were. And I don't, I don't want to, take away from any of those experiences, but I think sometimes I put him up in places that, that maybe he deserves, maybe, but I'm sure he was just like many other fathers, in this country that, he just happened to be my dad.
Yeah. It's a great life for me. And everyone I meet that has had a life like that is just really an exceptional person too. They have a perspective on life that I was just talking about this, you just don't know unless you know. I mean, it's really hard to communicate what this feels like unless you've done it. And even if you've done it, you might not have the same connection that say I've had or you've had, because different things mean different things to people. And so, that profound moment for me and having that person there next to me might just be a little, oh, that was cool. Thanks for showing me. And you're like, oh, but that was great. That was the greatest thing ever. I can't believe we pulled that together. And they're like, well, oh, cool. Yeah.
Everybody has, I think, though, it's like all relative, right? And I think that sometimes, I just got off fishing a river here in Montana for almost a month. And we had some days that were absolutely epic, right? Like that one, that you're like, I can't believe that this is happening. And not everybody, had the same excitement, I would say, for those days, just because, they hadn't gone through maybe the other days where it hadn't been like that. So It's all relative, but I think that's a good thing.
Well, so far in 2022, what does that look like for you? I know you took some time off, but how did after the fall, I can only imagine it's super busy to get back to business, but also, there's a lot of fishing and hunting opportunities in the spring too. So I was wondering what 2022 looks like so far for you.
And let's just say, people may think that I don't work during the fall, but I don't hunt and fish as much as I want. With this great job that I have at Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, I don't hunt and fish as much as I want. But I would say the memory right now, and I'm going to write a story about this, but my son, who turned 11 this year, we've been trying to get him a trout on top water for a long time. And, his sister, who's older than him, caught a trout when she was 9 on top water. And he's had plenty of opportunities. It just hasn't worked out. And whether that's setting the hook or, just all sorts of things like that hasn't worked out. And so this year we were supposed to go on a float on the Smith River, just us two. It's the only permitted river here in Montana.
It's beautiful too. Oh my God.
It's gorgeous. It's phenomenal. But the day before we were supposed to float, Fish, Life and Parks called us and said the flow was too low. And, you can float that river maybe on a raft at 150 CFS, but it was at 78. And so there was no way we could float it. And so that was a huge disappointment. That would have been our time, right? In those 5 days, some unlucky trout would have accidentally inhaled his fly and he would have. But it didn't happen. And so then we went out one day on my birthday, actually, in April. And same thing. I had him on fish. He just couldn't set the hook. So this month in June, I had him for 3 days up in one of my favorite places, just east here of Missoula. Salmon fly hatch is happening. So the fish are voracious. And that first day, again, he misses 3 or 4, 5, 6, 7 fish just right away. And he's frustrated. I'm just telling him to be patient. It's going to happen. And finally, we come around this corner and really on this river, it's a cobblestone river and there's not many kind of hydraulics, but in this certain spot, all water goes to this cliff. And so there's this boiling water. And it's a place where I've caught a ton of fish, especially subsurface. And his fly sucks underneath and some unsuspecting cut bow grabs this fly and we catch this fish and we fight it, and we get over to the side and he's got it in his hands and I ask, all right, you ready for the picture? And then that fish disappears into the ether, back into the water. So we didn't get a picture of that fish. But what I would say, I wouldn't say he even set the hook, right? That fish inhaled his fly when it was underneath the water. But we got it in hand. And once we got it in hand, I think it was like a confidence builder because he ended up catching, 9 more fish that day. And then we fished for 2 more days. He caught, fish after that. His casting, his mend right after the cast because we're fishing on fast water. All of that came together, but I would say there was one particular moment that he looked back at me and, I'll never forget this. Just kind of turned around to me and smiled. And I could tell that he had got it and he didn't even say anything, but it was this moment where we both looked each other in the eyes, and he's smiling at me. And you want to talk about memories. Maybe he'll forget that someday, but I will never forget that. And, it took a long time, Jeff. And I think maybe that's why it meant so much more to both of us, but me in particular. It's just that, it was a way for that connection probably back to my father and the experiences I've had with him and is passing that on to my son. So that happened in June. So nothing super epic as far as that, but I would say for us as a team and for him as an individual, that was a very big moment.
Yeah. So when people are considering or trying to keep kids interested with all these distractions that are happening, what would be your recommendation to parents in just trying to, keep their kids engaged in the outdoors and keep them wanting and desiring those opportunities? Because it's, I have 2 kids, they're both teenagers and, their interest comes and goes. And they're at an age now where I really can't, tell them what they should be doing. They're 13 and 15. They have their own friends. And, how would you, or what would you recommend to, parents who are like, wow, I really would love to get my kids, I love my son or my daughter to catch and have that experience of a dry fly, of a trout eating a dry fly or whatever whatever matters to them that they would like to pass on. What kind of advice do you give to parents to kind of keep that interest going?
Yeah, I'd start with when they're young. Get them outside. That's when they can't make decisions, when they're 13 and to 15, like you're talking about, or they don't have, that screen in front of them that's always glowing, that's addicting and trying to get them to pick it up. So that young age, my parents did it to me. I did it with my kids. I just got them out and did everything that we did, so putting my kids on my back when I'm fly fishing, camping at a very young age at 2, big game hunting with me, doing the very similar to what my dad did, just following me and watching me hunt. So I'd say that early on, just they can do a lot more than you think they can.
Oh yeah.
And so get them out. But then the second piece is expectations. I think that, I think, and I've had to like get better at this, but there's sometimes, like, let's take this fly fishing piece. Like, I really wanted my son to catch a trout. Like, that was a really big deal. It's kind of a big deal for him. And so, but not as big of a deal as it probably was for me. And so, there was days when we stopped, he wanted to stop fishing, but I knew if we just spent another 20 minutes, maybe we could catch a fish. But it's that expectation, like, okay, he's had a good time. Let's go home. And while he didn't catch a fish, he still had a good time. He had a good experience outside. So expectations, I think, is a really important one. We have our own expectations and we put them on them. And so I think that's one. And I'd say 2 more. Have fun when you're doing it, right? Like, I think I always, when I'm done with some kind of hunting or fishing thing outside, we go to this burger joint here in Missoula called the Missoula Club. We eat burgers, we throw peanuts on the floor, and we eat milk and we drink milkshakes. That has nothing to do with the outdoor experience we did, but it is a heck of a lot of fun, and they look forward to it, right? So fun, and like include, candy, like have something to look forward to when they're going to the woods with you that maybe they don't get all the time. And that expectations thing, when I'm big game hunting in particular, like it's like, they got to be quiet, and you're trying to tell them to be quiet. Or when you're duck hunting, don't move. Well, guess what? They're going to talk and they're going to move. And so, realize that you may not shoot something that day. They're probably going to learn something and they're probably going to have fun. Yeah. But you may not shoot something because of just the situation. And so I think, but have fun. The last thing I think is where you're at, and it's where I'm at with my daughter. My daughter's just turned 14. She's got soccer. She's got friends. I'm probably 3rd or 4th on the list, if that. Yeah. And I just meet her where she is, and when she can get out, like we go do that. We went to the Boundary Waters last summer, and
that's a neat experience.
Oh, it's amazing. And I had 5 days with my daughter without her phone, and I felt like I got her back, but I'm not forcing her, to go out. And when she is there, then I'm like, okay, like just enjoy this moment while I got it, and I don't get them as much as I want. Right. But, meet her where she is, because like you just said, I could force her to go do things with me, but she would, oh my God, the reaction would be not what I want, especially long term. So, that's
my daughter's got the world totally under control. I mean, since the moment she was born, she's had everything pretty figured out. But I do have, a great memory with my daughter at an early age. And I just made sure I had some nice hot chocolate in the pack. We'd totally hike up into the woods and into the forest, and it was less about deer hunting than more about looking at the mushrooms and sitting there and having hot chocolate. And early season, we never saw a deer, but it was a great day just because we got to hang out and share some hot chocolate. And I just, one day it was kind of wet and rainy, and we sat on this stack of logs, and and I busted out the thermos of hot chocolate, and somehow I had messed it up. I'd used the wrong chocolate or something like that, but it came out almost like soup. And she just kind of said, "It's okay, Dad. it's still good." And I'm like, "Oh, this is the worst hot chocolate we ever had." So yeah, like you said, kids are pretty durable, and they're incredibly I don't know what the word is. They just like everything's okay if they're happy. And my son, just this year, I hunt and fish a lot, and neither one of them are knocking me down to take them hunting or fishing. But this summer, a friend of my son's, his father booked out some guide days up in Alaska with an outfitter, and he was stoked to go. And it was the first time I've seen my son just like, yeah, I'm going salmon fishing. So he went with a buddy. So that's the other thing too, is that, me at my age, I might not be the most interesting person to hang out with all day. And his friend is way more interesting. And same with my daughter. She's ski racing and doing all kinds of wonderful things. But, would you rather hang out with your other 13 and 14-year-old girlfriends, or would you rather go hang out with Dad and maybe catch a fish or something like that? But yeah, those days are really precious. They're really special. And I think finding that balance between what your hopes and expectations are and what they really want to get out of it is the challenge, because, you know, everyone has an idea of how the day should go and it never goes the way you want it to.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, we can take that. I mean, if we spend, you know, you and I spend a lot of time in the woods, and so we know that anything hardly ever goes how you plan it, right? And
Right.
so it's like, what do you do with that? And I
Right.
think, you know, the example of the hot chocolate that you gave, you know, I mean, she was totally fine with that, you know, and thought it was good, you know.
Totally, it was the best.
You know, and sometimes, let's say like a storm comes in, you got to go home. Like, that's okay.
Yeah.
You know? It's
Yeah.
okay. And if they want to go home, it's not the end of the world, you know. So.
She has an amazing sense of direction. She's a little compass in her head. Just I for years never used a compass, and I'm not saying people shouldn't. I just never needed one because I understood the terrain and the topography, and I hunted in some pretty remote areas too. But she has that ability to just kind of know where you are and which way to go. Except for one night, she wanted to stay in the forest a little late, and we had to make our way back to camp. And when we came out, she counted the number of times that we crossed the creek, and she counted, you know, the direction we were going and how many times we turned. But when we came back, we had to cross the creek at the headwaters, which added one more time to crossing the creek. And when we got down to where we were going to cross the creek the last time, she looked down and she said, "But Dad, we're supposed to go that way." And she's like 8 or 9 years old, and she's telling me which way we're supposed to go. And we had a moment in the forest at dark with a headlamp getting dim. And I was like, I know you think you know which way we're supposed to go, but actually camp is over here. And she was absolutely certain that camp was this direction. And it was, you know, one of the greatest moments for me, because I knew that she was paying attention and she was counting, and she was listening and watching everything around her, and in the dark knew in her mind which way to go. And obviously, had she had a compass or something like that, it would have told her she needed to go the other way. But the fact that she was paying so much attention at that age, you know, being in the woods with me means that, you know, there's stuff going on upstairs. She's just not walking along behind me. She's paying attention and making calculations as well. And that was just fascinating to me.
Well, Jeff, she's only 14 right now,
I know.
or somewhere in there, but
Yeah.
Look out. Like, sounds like you got, I mean, congratulations, I would say.
Yeah.
And good luck.
Yeah, she's strong. She's really strong. You know, we've talked a little bit about, you know, our personal experiences and how we kind of came to be who we are. But right now, I think one of the things that I want to shift direction a little bit and move it towards to other, you know, the general public or other hunters and anglers. And I'm kind of curious what you think the short-term role of hunters and anglers are to address the issues that you're dealing with right now, but also what are those short-term goals or short-term roles that hunters and anglers can play to keep the ball rolling in the right direction? Because we could, if things, you know, stale or spin off, things could change pretty dramatically with the climate that we're dealing with, and literally, I mean, the climate, or also our policy efforts. So, what is that short term thinking that hunters and anglers should be focused on?
I mean, short term, I'll say, I mean, you've kind of already said it, but like, what we are experiencing today did not happen by accident, you know, and there's, you know, thousands of people that came before us. And, you know, we know some of the big names like the Theodore Roosevelts or the Aldo Leopolds or the Rachel Carsons of the world. But there was thousands of other people that helped to deliver what we have today. And that is our conservation legacy. And we should be proud of that. We should know that history. But right now, there's only a handful of people that are carrying that forward. And when I say that about the hunter and angler ranks, right? Like this idea that hunting is conservation, right? That we buy licenses, we provide excise taxes through firearms and ammunition, or through fishing equipment or bow equipment. That's all awesome, but it's not enough. It's absolutely not enough. And I think there is too few people. I think hunters and anglers have become a little complacent, and they think, well, you know, if I keep buying my licenses every year and I contribute through Pittman Robertson, you know, through these excise taxes, like I'm doing enough. Well, enough doesn't carry the day. And, you know, everything we had that we have now wasn't because people did the bare minimum or what was required by law. It's because they stepped up and did something, further than that. So short term is recruiting. I think like these recruit your friends, like when you're in the duck blind or when you're, in the truck in the morning, when you're driving to the trailhead, like talk about this conversation and let's be proud of where our license dollars go. Let's be proud of where these excise taxes go. But let's also, in the same conversation, inspire people to do more. And I think that short-term piece, it'll help us accomplish all of our policy goals. It'll help us think about how we, maybe look at these long-term pieces in addition. And so that short-term piece for me is really realizing that we need to do more than just buy our licenses and hunt and fish.
I think, too, that keeping perspective on the idea that it's public land and it is every much the right or the property, public property of the retiree, the woman who's living in Orlando, Florida somewhere, as it is someone just living down the street from me here on the Oregon coast, or the person who lives in the forest. And I mean, that idea that it's really, that makes it like a bigger issue if people would acknowledge, really the role that the general public play and their responsibility. To your point, just, buying equipment helps, but the base is really everyone and helping. It seems like the challenge is getting everyone to understand that this is everyone's asset, as opposed to the idea that, some of it's private, some of it's public. I can't get there anyways because, an interesting story for me, when I was working on that ballot initiative in 2004, we did a study to find out how many people in this one county near this state forest even knew where their drinking water was coming from. And 14% of the people we studied knew where their drinking water was coming from. That was it. They didn't know that the water that they were drinking and feeding their children and living on was a product of the state forest. It came from a reservoir, and the forest around the reservoir was managed by the Oregon Department of Forestry. And that just blew me away that there was so little civic engagement there that people really had a clue, where one of their basic requirements of life came from. So it's, to that end, it's, that short-term goal of getting the word out is so important, but it is a huge job because there are so many people who hold interest in this. I mean, it's the idea that it's your land is really a big concept to try to get out.
Yeah, no, man, you're speaking my language. So, this short-term goal that I talked about that you just articulated even further is like leads me into the long-term goal, right? And this long-term goal is that, hunters and anglers are seen by the general public as the contributors to conservation that we are, beyond license sales, beyond excise taxes. And then this idea that we all, that collective all, not just hunters and anglers, but every single user group out there, or maybe even this woman, that's in Florida, that will never set foot on that public land in Oregon, but has ownership to it. And it gets down to, clean air and clean water and opportunity for all. And that, to me, if we can, that long-term goal, I think we'll always have discussions on how this public land should be used, and in which way and at what time and in, how. But if we have this collective American ideal that public lands is important to us and it belongs to everybody, that long-term goal, that public lands, I'm happy for the future of public lands and happy for the role that hunters and anglers will play in it. That, it's available to all and that, you may be an ATV rider. And so you can do that over here at this time of year and in this way. And then over here, you're, an equestrian rider and you can ride your horse. So, so you're like, we're not saying, no, this is all for horses or this is all for ATV riders, but we're all using this public lands together. Is it perfect for anybody? Probably not. But is it a path forward for all? I would say yes. And so my long-term goal is just that we all have a stake in these public lands and these public waters. And then we all recognize the importance that it is important that not just one user group or two user group dominates that landscape, but that we all get to use it. And, I think as more and more people get in the outdoors, we have pressures that way, or you have many more people moving to cities, and so they're less connected, to the public lands and public waters.
Mm-hmm.
This is going to be a conversation that's going to be at the crux of everything that we do. And I think if we continue the work, we'll get it right, and we'll far into the future, we'll respect the natural resources and what they provide for us, because we are participants or active users of our outdoors. But we have to do that, or I think it's a much different picture.
It also brings to mind, it's not a loaded question, but it's a question that we have around the campfire when we're hunting, is like, well, what if everyone wanted to hunt and fish? What would this landscape look like if everyone all of a sudden decided, oh, look, hey, this is my land and I'm going to take advantage of it. And then those, hundreds of millions of Americans decide to go to the forest and exercise their rights. That's part one of that question. What would your vision of that future look like?
I think we all talk about recruitment unless those people show up at our spot, right? And we all have a spot that we used to go to that was, quote unquote ours, even though it was public land. And then all of a sudden it was discovered by others, and it has changed, the fundamentally kind of where that is. So I'd answer that in a couple ways. I think that, first of all, we need to work on access to our public lands. And so that we not only do we have more access, I would say, so that we have more access points to our public lands, and a lot of which are inaccessible right now. That's what I would say to that. I would say, we have 640 million acres of federally managed public lands in this country. And as, more and more, let's say, pressure gets put on that, let's add to it. And I think that, I know my home state of Montana in particular pretty well, is that you have a lot of traditional landowners that are, no longer going to have that ranch in their family because their kids have decided to do something else. They would like to pay it forward and give that land to the people, for a fair price. But this idea that we're done growing the public estate, I think is not I think we can continue to grow the public estate. And then I think we can, provide a way to distribute our folks through access opportunities, and so that we don't have those pressures. And, myself, I would say, as frustrated as it's been at a duck spot that was in particular, it was close to here to Missoula. Well, I just had to, the beauty is that I got plenty of other places to go explore, to go try to find my new duck spot. While it may be frustrating, it also, we need people to experience the outdoors in a way that is visceral, and so that they want to protect them into the future. And I think that the more and more people that we get out there that have those visceral kind of reactions, and that can be, the sun on your face, that can be when a great blue heron blows up and you remember, that kind of sound that it made. That's visceral and something you'll never forget. And so we need to be able to provide those opportunities for people. And if that means that, some of my places aren't going to be the same, so be it. I'll go find others.
Now, the other side of that question is, what if no one showed up? What would the future of public lands look like?
I mean, I think if nobody shows up, then you have, that's a great question, right? And so then where is the constituents to talk about how that public land is managed? And, at that point, I get very nervous because big business always shows up, right? And so instead of the wise use of our public lands, I think it goes back to, some of the reasons these public lands were set aside in the first place. I think it goes back to unsustainable use and rape and pillage of our public lands. And that's very short term. So if we don't show up, I think somebody else will. I think I've said this before, but I'll say it now, is that, if we're not at the table, so if we're not active participants, we're not out there hunting and fishing, then we're on the menu. And at that point, these public lands won't have the advocates that hunting and fishing or other outdoor pursuits creates. And at that, do they go away? Are they sold? Are they, defiled? And so that they're no longer productive for clean air and clean water in particular. I think that's a real question to ask ourselves.
My bigger concern isn't that everyone shows up, but my biggest concern is that no one shows up. Because, I'm surrounded by state forest land, and in Oregon, it has happened before where the state land has been put on the chopping block, and people either bid on it or, land that was dedicated to generate revenue for schools was either not managed correctly or didn't yield what they thought it was going to yield or became too expensive to maintain. And that land was just basically put up for sale. And if it weren't for some posturing and decisions making by the land board in Oregon, that land would not be public land anymore. And now it's, a managed forest for scientific purposes, which, that's great too, because the more you learn about it, the better you can manage it. But it has happened in Oregon, and I'm sure it'll happen again, and it'll happen in other spots where if no one shows up and nobody seems to be interested in that piece of public land, the timber's worth something. The water rights, the mineral rights are all worth something. And if someone decides that it's better for, the general public to, sell it, it's gone forever, and you're never going to have that experience again. You're never going to be able to go back and, sit on that rock you did when you were a kid and watch the fish spawn or whatever. It's just gone. You can't do that. So that's my bigger concern. And, being a hunter here in Oregon, they're changing the regulations a lot. We're going to some controlled hunts for, what used to be a general archery tag. And I just don't know. The point of that is to reduce the pressure on the animals, right? And that in itself makes perfect sense. But reducing the access to those places and the number of people from different states. I mean, it's Oregon, Washington, Idaho, California are the states that are really converging on those northeastern Oregon units that used to be an over-the-counter tag. And I'm really going to be curious to see if the elk population actually improves. And then overall, what's the demographic effect going to be on people who, have an interest in or choose to or want to, just they can't afford an expensive out of state tag. They live in Oregon down the street and they want to go hunting, but they can't because they don't have the points or they can't afford, the process. So I think, I don't know. We're in a weird time in that the population itself of the animals and the management policies, the management objectives are driving a lot of these decisions when it comes to who can and can't access that land. And my bigger concern is what happens if no one shows up.
Yeah, I think you're referencing maybe the Elliott State Forest. In that situation, like I'm not as concerned about people not showing up to hunt and fish. I'm concerned about people not showing up to voice their opinion, right?
Yeah,
like that Elliott State Forest, it was 80,000 plus acres. That would have been gone.
Yeah.
Unless people would have stepped up, our local members with BHA or, Oregon Hunters Association, without that kind of, engagement. And I think that, to your point about allocation, I think that these are all ongoing conversations that we need to have, and I think that, let's look at science, but there's also this kind of human factor that we have to look into. But to me, I'm less worried about people showing up to hunt and fish. I'm more worried about them showing up to the meeting. Like everybody likes to go out and chase critters around, but nobody really likes to go to a meeting and raise their hand and give their piece. But man, that is the way this country works, is the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And if you are not there, somebody else is. And I guarantee you that they're getting their point across when you're not. So that's what I'd say, but I'm right there with you.
Yeah. And to that point too, I mean, there have to be some really profound successes for you while working at BHA. In taking all those things into consideration, and so I guess what I want to ask, while you have worked at BHA, what's your greatest professional success while working at BHA? I know there's a lot of things that you've done, but if there's one that stands out that you just kind of went, oh man, that's gonna.
You're right. There's many different ways I can answer this question. But I will, since we've been talking about access, particular just right now, and participation, and I will bring out probably one of the biggest things that I've ever worked on in my career. And that was the Great American Outdoors Act that passed 2 summers ago. And within that, there was the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And the Land and Water Conservation Fund, that those that don't know about it, it was established in 1964. It's when there was a bunch of oil and gas development starting to take place in the Gulf of Mexico, and senators at that point, had the foresight to say, we're taking away from one resource, let's give back to another. So Land and Water Conservation Fund has been used in every single county in America. It's used for large scale conservation as well as access projects, making sure that people have access to our public lands and our public waters. And so, for a long time, it was authorized at $900 million a year. Now, $900 million back in 1964, it bought you quite a bit. But in, the year 2022, that doesn't buy you as much anymore. But that all said, we were not getting the full $900 million ever because we had to go through the appropriations process every time. So we get, $350 million that was spread between 50 states and did some amazing work all across this country in every single county. But now we're going to have $900 million a year in perpetuity that will go back to access and to conservation. And, there was another piece of that bill that added, $10 billion to address some of the backlog of maintenance that we have on our public lands, which is vitally important. We got to take care of our house, so it doesn't fall apart. But the one that I will say that I just, it's that long lasting kind of legacy piece is $900 million a year forever. And when, I first got here in 2013, if I would have asked a room full of 100 people that were BHA members, how many people know what the Land and Water Conservation Fund is? Maybe 1 out of 100, maybe 2 out of 100 would raise their hand and say they knew what it was. Right now, if you ask a room of 100 people at BHA, I guarantee you 98 people would raise their hands. The reason they would raise their hands because we did, our chapter leaders, our staff, we did a ton of education around that. And so, 2 years ago, when this finally was up to potentially being passed, our members made 5,000 phone calls out to Congress the last month before this thing was passed. I'm proud of that. One of the reasons I'm proud of that is that we didn't provide them a script. We said, here's the issue. Can you make a call? And every single time they picked up the phone and they made that phone call, and we didn't have to tell them what to say because they knew already what it was. I'm proud of what this will provide for access and conservation going forward. But I'm almost just as proud of, of the education effort that happened and then the implementation of just engaging in a grassroots effort, people did something and then they were rewarded for it. And so that'll be one that sticks with me for a very long time.
That's excellent. Yeah, I remember when that happened. And it was really it just kind of came out of nowhere too, because no one was really thinking that in that particular climate that something like that could happen. And it was really a shocker to me that, wow, that got done.
If there's political reasons it got done, we're in election year. Senator Daines from Montana and Senator Cory Gardner from Colorado were both in cycle, and they needed this, for their reelection efforts. And so I think that was part of it. But if that education effort hadn't happened and those people knew this politics could happen on the side, but it needed that grassroots effort to get it done. And so I think, the political timing along with the people's will got that thing over the finish line.
Yeah, so grassroots is really key for you. I mean,
Absolutely.
You're all in on grassroots. And it's interesting because, the idea of that grassroots groundswell, it works sometimes and sometimes it doesn't. And I don't know, because I'm not in your position. I can't put a finger on why sometimes those efforts work and are successful, and other times all it takes is a phone call from one person to steer the needle. It's a mystery to me what does steer that needle and what it is that influences the clock. We have a lot of grassroots efforts on fish conservation out here on the West Coast, and man, we just have the hardest time addressing water quality issues and addressing being effective with it. I should say, being effective. We address it, but we're not necessarily as effective as we would like to be. So that's what's really a mystery to me, is what is that combination of so it has to be an education component, but it also has to have a commitment component where you're committing to this. You're all in on whatever the message is that you decide it should be, or wherever you're trying to steer the needle.
Yeah, I think it's like a combination of both in a lot of ways, right? I think that a lot of these conversations that happen behind closed doors, the proverbial smoke-filled rooms where, a lot of these decisions are made or a path forward, those conversations wouldn't happen without pressure from the outside. The grassroots pressure that I think it sets the table for some of those conversations, right? And so, could I dial in a perfect recipe on how things are done every single time? I don't think so, because I think everyone is there's a different situation. But what I do know that, works is when the people use their voice. Politicians, love them or hate them, they're there to serve us. And when the people demand something, they kind of stick that finger up in the air and which way is the wind blowing? Well, if we're blowing one way pretty hard, they're going to listen to that. And then, what I think is what a great solution is like, okay, I love it when a politician calls me or their staff calls me and says, turn off the machine, right? We're getting too many phone calls. Like, my boss was at a meeting last week with a bunch of grade school kids and they brought up this issue. Like, come on, stop.
I got it already.
Exactly. Like, they've heard you, but now they need that conversation behind closed doors on figuring out a path forward, right? Like, you've put them in a corner. Now, how are you going to help them get out of that corner, right? And I think that too often that we beat these politicians up and don't give them an out. Like, we got to have them be part of the solution. And then when they are part of the solution, especially when they were not in the right place to begin with, you got to applaud them when they do the right thing, and it's just like training a dog, and I'm serious. I mean, I'm not suggesting, by the way, don't anybody.
I wasn't going to go there.
We're not putting shock collars on any politician. But the idea, if you're training a dog and all you ever do is reprimand that dog when it does something wrong and never reward it when it does something right, like, that dog is never going to know really what to do. And in fact, I would say they probably get more out of being rewarded when they do the right thing than when they get reprimanded for doing the wrong thing. And so, our jobs as a grassroots constituencies is, to, raise some hell. But when they do the right thing, make sure that we're thanking them, because I think that goes a long way and it lets them find a path where when they do the right thing again, they're going to get that same praise.
That's wonderful. Yeah. Well, that's how I train my dog. She knows how to turn the collar off. Let's put it that way. She does the right thing, and then it doesn't bother her anymore.
Exactly.
Well, that's great. Well, I want to talk a little bit about 2022 and beyond. What's coming up? Well, first of all, from a recreational standpoint, you just came off a month and a half of just probably having a great time in the great outdoors of Montana. Yeah. What does your fall look like? I know that you're busy working wise, but what kind of hunting do you usually pursue? When you have time to do that.
We've already talked about duck hunting.
Yeah.
It's something that I can fit in many different places. I can hunt before work. I can hunt, for, a half a day on the weekends. And so I do a lot of bird hunting, not just duck hunting, but a lot of upland bird hunting. I got a black lab. She's 5 years old, and I spend a lot of time, just her and I, to be totally honest, and just getting it in when we can. So that's something I'll do a lot of this fall, or not as much as I want, but I'll do quite a bit of. Big game hunting is I'm putting stuff in the freezer, and so I drew a doe tag this year in a spot I call the grocery store. It's public access actually to private land. It's through our block management program, then it's interspersed through public land too. But in the 4 out of the last 5 years that I've gotten this tag, I've filled my tag within an hour, and so I call that the grocery store. So I got that tag. And then I pulled a cow tag, a cow elk tag in a spot where I hunt mule deer. Mm-hmm. And so I'm very excited to hopefully, not only chase mule deer, but also put a, cow elk in the freezer. So I've already talked to my wife. She's less interested in the doe. She's very interested in the cow elk because she knows how delicious that meat is.
Totally.
She knows how much it is too. That little doe, it'll give us some meat, but that, cow elk will be significant for our family. So those are the things that I'll probably be doing most. And, I usually take a backcountry trip into the Bob Marshall Wilderness every year on horses. Mm-hmm. This year I'm foregoing that because I did take that long time here in June. And so I won't have long extended periods, but I'll have, definitely a bunch of time out there chasing big critters and then chasing the ones that fly as well.
Yeah, it sounds like my fall. Every year I try to get out and spend a couple of weeks pheasant hunting. I have a 4-year-old black lab that I've trained, and she's in her prime. She is just an amazing flush. She actually points, and was if there are partridge around if the bird's holding, she'll just lock up and they're right here, and she's never wrong, which is. For a lab to be steady right there is really a blessing because I can just watch her and go, oh, this is going to happen. Yeah, man, I know when it's going to happen, even when she isn't pointing, when the birds are running. But that's such a neat thing, and like you said, just being out there with her and me and the dog, and something about wide open grasslands, whether it's wheat stubble or prairie grass, or, I spent some time in eastern Montana the last few years, and it's just beautiful out there. I just have to go back. And then also, I'm looking forward to creating a trip to South Dakota, North or South Dakota sometime. Cool. So I'll be coming through Montana on the way, so I'll give you a holler.
That North and South Dakota, man. I've hunted a lot there, and waterfowl in particular in North Dakota. I mean, it is. I mean, we're living in some pretty good times, and that's like a good spot to go hunt. And the ability to scout birds up there and then go ask a landowner for permission. I mean, they have to post up there yearly and put their phone numbers on, and they're posting for pheasants and, whitetails mostly. Yeah. And they want you to shoot those waterfowl. So it's like the Wild West still. I mean, you can drive around, scout, 10,000 birds that are working the field and go set up on them in the morning. Like, it's just,
and
you're making me want to go do something different this morning.
I don't know. I love to duck hunt as well. We don't have that. We don't have that opportunity here. I mean, it's just the way the Pacific Flyway sets up, and the way the interspersed public and private land dynamics. It's just, you don't really get that scouting opportunity. So that's something I would, I'm going to do before I die, which is spend some time, out there in the Central Flyway. And then, the big game thing, I'm the same way. I used to like to shoot, big bull elk with my bow, and I've done enough of that. And now it's just about getting some meat in the freezer. I have a doe tag as well. And I don't know what my elk season is going to look like. I might do some archery, but, it's just at this point, it's, where can I, take advantage of the little bit of time that I have and have the biggest reward, because, it's hard to spend a whole month of September traipsing around in the woods. I'm, almost 60. And so it's a little harder on my body than it used to be. I still enjoy it. It's just, oh my God, I'm dead by the time the season's over. It just wrecks me.
I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, I'd love to shoot a big bull too. I mean, and I'll be chasing them around, but, I think that, as I described the waterfowl and kind of upland hunting, that's conducive to my lifestyle right now. I talked about my 14-year-old daughter. She's going to be playing soccer this year. Well, games are on Thursday. She's in high school now, so games are on Thursdays and Saturdays, and that's going to cut down a lot of time for me. And so my big game, I hate going out for a couple hours, or I hate going out for half a day. Like, I just don't feel like I'm getting what I need to get done.
Right.
And so, when I go chase elk and deer around, it's going to be, like a very few times that I can actually do it the way I want to do it.
Yeah. And that takes time.
Totally. It's just time. It's the resource that we're not making any more of, that is the most finite, right? That I, every single time wish, that I had more of.
Exactly. And then someday we won't be able to do it anymore. And so it'd be wishing that you really did more of it.
Right. I mean, there's parts of me that wish I could clone myself, but I don't know if anybody could clone more Tawneys in the world. Yeah.
Or two of me.
Yeah.
Right. So I want to end this. I mean, this has been a really great conversation. I want to end this in kind of an interesting way. I want us to share our fondest memory that you think, well, anyways, I'm going to ask this in an interesting way. I want you to relate a story on public land that has a lasting impact on you, but you also think has a lasting impact on the listener.
All right. So
how's that for putting you on the spot?
That's on the spot. And the listeners can't see this, but I'm looking up at this hillside right now. It's outside my window, trying to think about what I'm going to talk about. And that last piece, that I think is what I'm going to key in on a story. Of lasting to the listener. So, one of the great things about public lands and public waters is these places that we can explore, we can challenge ourselves, we can fail, and we can succeed. Like, there's nothing like it. And so I would say that, my daughter, she was still hanging out with me. For her 10th birthday, I got a call even before her birthday about going into the woods, into the Frank Church, which is in Idaho. It's this wilderness in Idaho that's absolutely storied. And a friend of mine called me up, was like, "Hey, I got this trip and I got 2 slots open. Do you want to go?" And I said, I'd love to go, but I can't, because that's my daughter's same weekend as my daughter's 10th birthday. And he said on the phone without hesitation, "Well, why don't you bring her?" And I was like, "Oh, well, I didn't even think about that. She's 10 and we're going to the wilderness. I don't know, but she's been in the woods." And so I asked her, and it's barely out of my mouth, and she says yes. So there's all this anticipation. We're going in with some friends that have llamas. I've been a horse guy my whole life, but we've got llamas. Each of us is going to have our own llama that's going to carry our stuff in. We lead. So it's just really exciting. So we start out this trip, and, the first mile is flat, and it's easy. She's singing. There'd been a fire in there the year before, and so there's the black, a couple years before, so there's the black trees, but there's firewood that's coming up. It's that pink, just like the juxtaposition between the pink and the black, I'll never forget.
Yeah.
But she's having this great time, and I'm like, oh, I made the right decision. Like, Dad made the right decision. It's gonna be a great trip. So then we get that mile, and then we take a left, and that's when we start gaining elevation. Now we got to go up to this lake, and it's only like a 3-mile hike, but the next 2 miles are going to be in, a pretty steep trail. And then the last mile in particular, you got to get up past that little ridge before you get into the lake. And we're about halfway up through that next steep part, and she just stops talking. And my daughter and I are a lot alike, and so we're stopped talking, like something's wrong, because we're both kind of motor mouths. So I kind of noticed there, and I see her face. She's getting flush, and she needs to stop. It's hot. It was almost 100 degrees that day, and there's no shade because of this fire. There's dust on the trail. So it's pretty miserable. But we're with a group of people, about 15 people. And I don't know if you've ever hiked with 15 people, but, I asked, the leader of the group, or the one that was kind of, I'd call him the leader. So when are we going to stop? And he said, well, another 15 minutes. Well, 15 minutes turns into a half an hour, 45 minutes later. And we finally stop, and she's at the verge of tears. Like, she's crying, she's hot, she wants to go home. And I go from that first mile being the best dad ever to now like I gotta pull the plug. So this last ditch effort, I'm like, I gotta cool her off. And so she's 10 years old, and so I can pick her up still. And I picked her up, and I dunked her in the water. This isn't like, she was a willing participant in this. It wasn't like I did it against her will. But I cooled her off, and I gave her some food. The right color starts to return to her face. She starts to feel a little bit better. And then I tell her this story about Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt was not a great outdoorsman. He had asthma when he was younger, and was told, that he couldn't do anything athletic. But sheer grit inside of him he wanted to get outdoors. And so, against doctor's orders, he really led the life, what do you call it? The strenuous life is what he called it. Mm-hmm. And he did that with sheer grit. And, he could have chosen to let this affliction dictate, how he was going to work in the world, but he decided not to. So I tell her this story, and, he's a kind of a story person in our household, and I walk away. I'm like letting her just think about it. And I'm like, oh my goodness, like I'm going to come back to her, and this is going to be the moment. Like, what do we do? I come back to her, and I'm like, all right, like, do you want to keep going, or do you want to go home? And at that point, if she says we're going home, we're going home. Like, I'm making that decision. She's like, Dad, I think I got it, and let's go. And so she ends up, she's 10 years old. The next youngest person is probably 28. Youngest by far. She beats almost everybody up to the top of the mountain. And I'll never have a picture of her. And she's got her hands up above her head, like in triumph. And that ability that she learned when she was 10 years old about adversity and what you do with adversity, like, I hope that is something that she carries with her for the rest of her life. And that grit that she showed that day, I get weepy about it, because I watched it all happen in real time. And I know, there's things that have happened since then in her life that have not necessarily been physical, but have been trying, that I remind her of that. And it just takes one, just remember what it was like, when we were in the Frank church, and that mentality thing, which was that all was. That had little to do with physical ability, that had everything to do with their mental state at that point. Yeah. I think she's used it already, and she'll use it going in the future. And so impactful for me, impactful for her. Yeah. And then for anybody that's listening to this, when those chips are down, it's all about what you do with those chips. And sometimes that storm is coming in, and the best thing to do is go home. Mm-hmm. But the majority of time, we can face that adversity head on and get through it. And so to me, public lands provide, again, these places for us to test that all the time. And if without that, how do we face other challenges in our life that aren't on public lands and public waters without that experience? And I think they do, that these public lands and public waters provide that nothing else really can, that sets us up as a society to be able to deal with things that, quite frankly, a lot of times we walk away from or stick our head in the sands on. I think we need to be facing them head on. So that's what I'd leave you with.
That is the best way to end this. I don't know how to end a conversation better than that. I mean, and it also is a great tie into the very first thing we talked about, where, there are people who have had these experiences and they get it. And there are so many people who have yet to have those experiences who will get it. And we just hope that more and more people eventually get it, because it's just going to make it better for all of us. So, Lan, thank you. I can't tell you how great this conversation was. I knew it was going to be a good conversation, because I knew there was a lot of parallels there, but I didn't quite realize how many times they would cross over and how good of a conversation it would be. So thank you so much again. I really appreciated it.
Jeff, I appreciate the time. And I will say that, just having these conversations and going through some of these experiences I've had in my life, like I'm leaving this conversation with a big smile on my face. And I can't wait to go home and get my daughter in particular a big old hug right now. But thank you for your time as well. And thanks for doing what you're doing. I think that one of the ways that, we've talked about this education piece and just spreading the word, this podcast, it gives us an opportunity to have these conversations. And hopefully that there's some folks, that get inspired or find some things in their life that are parallel, just like ours were, and can take something out of this. So thank you for the opportunity.
No, you're welcome. Thank you. Fin and Fire with Jeff Mishler is brought to you by Fin and Fire Fly Shop, based in Redmond, Oregon. Fin and Fire is the West's leading retailer of the best fly fishing and hunting brands. Go to finandfire.com and see what I'm talking about. And if you'd like to help Tawney and his team make sure that we have continued access to public lands, go to backcountryhunters.org and find out where you can help. That's backcountryhunters.org.